He signed her name on the papers like she was an inconvenience. He was finally clearing off his desk. Adrian Voss didn't look at her once, not when the judge asked if both parties understood the terms. Not when the attorney slid the documents across the mahogany table. Not even when the bailiff cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the silence that had settled over the room like a held breath. Adrian kept his eyes fixed on his phone, scrolling through something. A text, a market update, maybe nothing at all. While his wife of 5 years sat 3 feet away and ceased to exist for him in real time. The courtroom wasn't large, but it felt enormous. A handful of witnesses. 2 legal teams. The low hum of climate control. Celine Ashcroft sat with her hands folded in her lap, wearing a gray dress she'd bought off a clearance rack, her dark hair pulled back without ceremony. No jewelry except for an old silver necklace, thin chain, small pendant, the kind of thing that looked like it might belong to someone's grandmother. She hadn't hired a stylist, she hadn't brought a friend, she had simply shown up the way she had always shown up for everything in her life. Quietly, without drama, without making a scene. Adrian's attorney, a man named Griffith, who smelled aggressively of cedar cologne, leaned toward her side of the table. My client is prepared to offer a generous settlement, $300,000, a vehicle of your choice from the household, and the right to remain in the Southbrook apartment for 60 days while you arrange alternative. I don't want the apartment, Celine said. Griffith blinked. I'm sorry? I said I don't want it. She turned the page, found the signature line. I'll take the necklace. That's all. The room went very quiet. Even Adrian looked up from his phone. Celine. His voice had that particular flatness he used when he wanted to sound reasonable and didn't quite manage it. Don't be dramatic. She didn't answer him. She picked up the pen, signed her name, clean, unhurried, no hesitation, and set it back down. Then she folded her hands in her lap again and looked at the window on the far wall where October rain was streaking the glass in thin, crooked lines. That's it? Griffith said, more to himself than anyone. That was it. Adrian watched her for 2 full seconds with an expression that flickered between confusion and something that might have been, briefly, relief. Then his phone buzzed. He looked down. Whatever he saw made one corner of his mouth curve, and he was already standing, already reaching for his jacket, already moving toward the door and the rest of his life before the ink had dried. He paused at the threshold, just long enough to speak over his shoulder without turning fully around. You should have asked for more, he said. At least then you'd have gotten something out of this. She heard the door swing shut behind him. Celine sat alone at the table for a long moment. She touched the necklace at her collarbone, just the tips of 2 fingers, barely a touch. And then she stood, gathered her coat from the back of the chair, and walked out into the rain without an umbrella. The city swallowed her whole. She walked 4 blocks before she stopped at a crosswalk and stood there while the signal cycled twice without her crossing. The rain soaked through the shoulders of her coat. A cab idled at the curb. She didn't take it. 5 years. Not 5 years of screaming matches and flying dishes and the kind of operatic misery that at least had the decency to announce itself. 5 years of something quieter and in many ways more corrosive, of being present in every room and genuinely invisible in all of them. Of cooking dinners that Adrian ate standing at the kitchen counter because he was always about to leave for something. Of learning not to mention her own thoughts unless they were useful to his. Of watching him look through her, around her, past her, with the patient tolerance of a man who had convinced himself he was doing her a favor just by being in the same building. She had loved him once. She was certain of that. Not with the breathless, consuming love of someone very young, but with something steadier. Something she had chosen deliberately, with clear eyes, knowing full well she was choosing an imperfect man. She had believed that was enough. She had believed, for longer than she should have, that if she was patient and present and real, he would eventually see her. He never did. What he saw was a woman without ambition, a woman without useful connections, a woman whose wardrobe didn't project the image he needed and whose conversational repertoire didn't dazzle the people he was trying to impress. He had said as much in different arrangements of words across several years. Never in one brutal declaration. Adrian was too controlled for that. It came in smaller installments. The slight pause before introducing her at events. The way he would redirect dinner conversation away from anything she'd started. The weekend trips to the city that she eventually stopped being invited on and stopped asking about. She had kept the necklace through all of it, It had belonged to her mother. Before her mother became a memory. Before the life Celine had walked away from at 22, quietly, without ceremony, the same way she did everything, had receded into something she could almost convince herself was a different person's history. She crossed the street on the third signal cycle, turned north without a destination. The rain was picking up. Behind her, she didn't see the black sedan that had been parked half a block from the courthouse since 9 that morning. She didn't see the man in the driver's seat, dark coat, jaw like quarried stone, lift a phone to his ear. "She's walking north on Callaway," he said. A pause. "She signed." Another pause. "Yes, just the necklace." The person on the other end of the line said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, a single word. "Good." The celebration was already underway by 7 that evening. Adrian had booked the private dining room at Merchant and Shore, 40 seats, leather banquettes, the kind of place where the menu had no prices, because the assumption was that if you needed to know, you couldn't afford it. He'd invited 30 people he called his inner circle, which was really just a rotating collection of whoever was most useful to him at any given moment. Vanessa Hale arrived on his arm in something gold and devastating, and the room shifted slightly when she walked in the way rooms do around people accustomed to being looked at. She was everything that Celine was not, or rather, everything that Adrian had told himself he needed, polished, connected, hungry for exactly the same things he was hungry for. They had been carrying on for nearly 2 years. He hadn't been particularly careful about hiding it. "To forward motion," he said, raising a glass, and the room echoed him. Vanessa laughed at something a city councilman said. Adrian accepted congratulations he hadn't bothered to correct the framing on. Several people seemed to be under the impression that he had ended the marriage decisively on his own timeline, which was true enough that he didn't see the need to elaborate. The truth was more complicated. The truth was that Celine had looked at him across that table and signed those papers with the calm efficiency of someone closing a tab at a coffee shop, and something about the absence of her distress had unnerved him in a way he'd been trying to outrun since 3 o'clock. He drank more than he intended to. By 9, the room was warm and loud and full of the particular intoxication of people who believe everything is going exactly as it should. Adrian stood near the window with a glass of bourbon and looked out at the city glittering below. His city, or something close to it, the city he had spent 15 years climbing toward. And he felt mostly satisfied. The faint mechanical roar reached him before it reached anyone else. At first he thought it was a news helicopter. They circled the financial district often enough, especially when markets were volatile, but this was lower, closer. And it wasn't the tentative circling sound of a traffic camera or a news crew. It was direct, deliberate, the deep percussion of something large and moving with absolute certainty about where it was going. The sound grew until the windows began to vibrate. Conversation in the room dropped, then stopped entirely. Someone said, "What the hell?" The helicopter came down in the plaza below. Not nearby, not on a rooftop. In the plaza itself, the open public square in front of the courthouse, 2 blocks south, where people were still gathered in small clusters despite the rain, and where the helicopter set down with the unhurried precision of something that did not expect to be questioned about its landing choices. It was matte black, military grade. The rotor wash scattered everything: umbrellas, signage, a rack of newspapers. People stumbled back and raised their arms against the wind. The doors opened. 32 men stepped out. Adrian counted later from the security footage because in the moment he couldn't process what he was seeing. They were dressed identically, dark tactical gear, no visible insignia, and they arranged themselves in 2 parallel lines with the measured synchrony of people who had done this before, in other plazas, in front of other buildings, in circumstances that had presumably ended in ways that discouraged future resistance. Then the last figure stepped out. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall that reads well in photos, but the kind that recalibrates the space around a person. He moved without urgency, which somehow made him more alarming than if he'd been rushing. Dark coat. No hat despite the rain. A face that the cameras caught only in profile for the first several seconds, and even in profile it communicated something. A settled, unblinking certainty that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with the absence of doubt. He walked through the 2 lines of men who did not move or speak. He crossed the plaza. He stopped in front of Celine. The footage would later be played on every news channel in the city. Paused, rewound, played again. Analysts would spend considerable energy trying to determine the significance of the gesture, whether it was calculated, symbolic, or something else entirely. What the cameras captured was this: the large man in the dark coat, standing in the rain in front of a woman in a gray dress, who lowered himself slowly to one knee on the wet stone of the plaza so that he was looking up at her. He said something. The audio was poor. Too much wind, too much rotor noise still cycling down. Lip readers would later argue about the exact words. But the woman's face was caught clearly in the footage, turned 3/4 toward the nearest camera, and what it showed was not surprise. It showed recognition. It showed something that looked, from a certain angle, like coming home. What? Adrian watched from 30 feet above. He didn't understand what he was seeing. He understood its pieces: helicopter, armed men, a woman in the rain. But the sum of those pieces refused to resolve into anything coherent. The bourbon was still in his hand. He hadn't moved. Vanessa appeared at his elbow. Adrian. Her voice was careful. Do you know who that is? Which one? The man kneeling. He stared down at the plaza. Something cold was moving through him that had nothing to do with the window glass or the October air outside it. He shook his head. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the plaza. That's Cassian Draven, she said. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Adrian heard someone behind him draw a sharp breath. The city councilman, he'd find out later, the one who'd been laughing with Vanessa 40 minutes ago, had gone the color of old wax. Two other men quietly set down their drinks and moved toward the exit without explanation, and nobody stopped them. That's not possible, Adrian said. His voice came out even, which surprised him. He just landed a helicopter in this courthouse plaza, Vanessa said. It's possible. Below, Cassian Draven rose to his feet. The woman, Celine, Adrian's mind corrected, still trying to reconcile the word with the image, placed her hand in his. He covered it with his other hand, briefly, then tucked her arm through his with the ease of long habit and turned back toward the helicopter. The two lines of men closed in behind them, unhurried. In 30 seconds, they were gone. The helicopter lifted, banked south over the river, disappeared. The plaza was just a wet, empty square again, rain hitting the stones where Cassian Draven had knelt, and Adrian stood at the window with cold bourbon in his hand and a very particular feeling spreading through his chest. Not yet fear, not yet anything he could name, but something adjacent to the sensation of stepping off a curb and realizing, in the fraction of a second between the step and the landing, that the ground is not where you thought it was. He looked at Vanessa. She was already looking at him. Who is she? He said. It was the first time in 5 years he'd asked that question about Celine, and he asked it the way you ask about a stranger. He didn't sleep that night. He told himself it was the bourbon. He told himself it was the adrenaline of the day, the culmination of months of legal maneuvering finally resolved, the natural restlessness that comes after a long tension releases. He lay in the bed in the suite he'd moved into 3 months ago when the separation became official, staring at the ceiling, while Vanessa slept beside him with the infuriating ease of someone whose world had not been rearranged. His phone showed him the footage at 2 in the morning. Someone had already uploaded it, several someones. It was spreading at the speed that things spread when they are exactly the kind of story people feel compelled to share. Not because they feel sorry for anyone, but because they sense, correctly, that it is the kind of thing that will be talked about, and they want to have been among the first to see it. The headline on the clip someone had reposted from a local news account read, Mafia King Draven kneels for mystery woman outside family courthouse. Adrian watched the footage 4 times. The way Cassian moved through the rain, the deliberateness of the kneeling. Not supplication, not theater, but something else. Something that read more like a formal acknowledgement, a title being restored. The way Celine had looked at him, not frightened, not overwhelmed, just present. The way she was almost never present in the photos Adrian had of her, the handful of events where he'd stood beside her for the camera, and she'd smiled without quite arriving behind the smile. He sat up, reached for his laptop, typed the name. Cassian Draven. He'd heard it before. Everyone in the city had heard it. The name surfaced periodically in news coverage that was always long on implication and short on specifics, because the specifics were either unconfirmed or carried the kind of liability that made editors careful. 44 years old. No confirmed address, no public record of prosecution, though his name appeared in the margins of 3 federal investigations over the past decade, always adjacent to catastrophic outcomes for whatever entity had been in conflict with his interests, never in a position where that adjacency constituted proof of anything. Head of the Draven organization. East Coast. Old money in the sense that the money had been accumulated through methods that significantly predated the current generation of white-collar financial crime. The family had been operating in various configurations since the 1940s. What they operated exactly depended on who you asked and how much you trusted the answer. There was a sister that was in one of the articles, a piece from 7 years ago in a financial publication that had gotten closer to the family than most before the journalist had apparently decided to pursue other interests, and the article had never been followed up. The sister was referenced only once, in a single paragraph. The Draven organization is believed to be structured around a small number of blood relatives, including Draven's younger sister, whose name does not appear in any public record. Adrian read the sentence 3 times. He set the laptop on the bed beside him and looked at the opposite wall for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Griffith. The attorney answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with sleep and poorly concealed irritation. "Adrian, it's 2:15. "The necklace," Adrian said. A pause. "I'm sorry?" "The necklace she took, the silver one. Did you see it?" I saw she was wearing a necklace, yes. Did you see the pendant?" Another pause, longer. "No." "Adrian, find out everything about a man named Cassian Draven by 6 tomorrow morning," Adrian said. "Everything that's findable. And then find out—" He stopped. The sentence felt strange in his mouth, like a word in a language he'd been mispronouncing for years without knowing. "Find out who his sister is." He ended the call before Griffith could answer. The city outside was quiet except for the rain. Adrian sat in the dark with his phone in his hand and thought about a woman in a gray dress, signing her name on a line without hesitation, taking nothing but a silver necklace, walking into the rain. And not once, not for a single moment, looking back. He thought about 5 years of dismissing the unhurried, undemanding presence of someone he had categorized almost immediately as not quite enough. The clearance rack clothes, the modest tastes, the complete absence of social performance. He had read these things as deficits, as evidence that she lacked the ambition or the awareness to be more. And he had maintained a low, settled conviction that her contentment with small things was simply the contentment of someone who didn't know what large things looked like. He was beginning to understand that he might have been reading the evidence incorrectly. He didn't sleep. At 6:14 in the morning, Griffith called back. His voice, when he spoke, had a quality Adrian had not heard in it before. A careful, deliberate flatness. The kind of tone people use when they are trying to convey information while also making absolutely clear that they are simply the messenger. "Her name," Griffith said, "before she married you. Her legal name, the one scrubbed from every accessible database we could find, the one that took my contact at the county records office 3 hours, and what he described as significant personal discomfort to locate. Griffith. Is Seraphine Draven." The rain had stopped sometime before dawn. The city outside Adrian's window was just beginning to go gray, the particular tentative gray of early morning, and somewhere in the streets below a truck was making its first rounds, and Adrian Voss sat on the edge of his bed with his phone against his ear and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely afraid. "She's his sister," he said. Not a question. "His only surviving family," Griffith said, "and according to what I was able to piece together, the last heir of everything the Draven family holds." Adrian closed his eyes. The silver necklace. The pen set down without flourish. The door she had walked out of without looking back. At least then you'd have gotten something out of this. What he had said to her. What he had said. He pressed the heel of his hand against his mouth and sat in the gray morning light with that sentence replaying in the full, nauseating weight of how wrong he had been settling over him like something he would be carrying for a very long time. Griffith's voice was still in his ear when Adrian's second phone, the one he kept for business, the one whose number appeared on 17 different letterheads and 3 city council speed dials, began to ring. He didn't recognize the number. He answered anyway, because at 6:17 in the morning with the name Seraphine Draven, Still rearranging everything he thought he knew about the last 5 years of his life, answering an unknown number felt like the least dangerous thing happening to him. "Mr. Voss." The voice on the other end was measured, male, accent that suggested somewhere mid-Atlantic, educated, the kind of diction that people spend money to acquire. "I represent certain financial interests that intersect with yours. I'm calling as a courtesy, because courtesies are extended before they become unnecessary. I thought you should know that 3 of your primary lending institutions will be terminating their agreements with you before the end of business today." Adrian's hand tightened on the phone. "That's not possible? I understand the impulse to say that, but I'd encourage you to verify before you finish the sentence." A brief pause. The sound of something, paper maybe, or the deliberate theater of paper. "Your development on Hargrove Street. The financing is being recalled. The Meridian Tower pre-sales agreement. The institutional investor is withdrawing. And the credit line through Coastal Premier Bank, which I believe you've been using as collateral for the waterfront acquisition. Who are you?" The voice didn't accelerate or slow. It simply continued, as if Adrian hadn't spoken. "Will be frozen as of 9 o'clock this morning. I wanted you to hear it from a human being rather than from an automated notification, which I think you'll agree is the kinder option." Another pause. "Have a good morning, Mr. Voss?" The line went dead. Adrian sat without moving for 11 seconds. He counted them without meaning to, the way you count in the immediate aftermath of something you haven't processed yet, your brain buying itself time by performing small mechanical tasks. Then he called his financial director, then his attorney at the development firm, then the personal contact he maintained at Coastal Premier, a man named Sutherland who had been doing him professional favors for 9 years, and who answered the phone with the careful, overly neutral voice of someone who had already been told what to say. "Marcus," Adrian said, "tell me the Hargrove line is intact." A pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. "Adrian, I've been trying to reach you since 6. Tell me." "I can't." Sutherland's voice dropped, as though someone might be listening through the walls of wherever he was sitting. "We got the instruction last night. I don't know where it originated. It didn't come from our board, I can tell you that much, because 3 of our board members are asking the same questions you are, and nobody has answers yet. But the instruction came with documentation I've never seen before. Cross-referenced accounts, transaction histories, things that should not exist in any accessible database but apparently do." He stopped. "Adrian, whatever you did, whatever you're involved in, I strongly recommend you get ahead of it." "I haven't done anything." The silence on Sutherland's end was not the silence of someone who believed him. It was the silence of someone who understood that whether or not Adrian had done anything was no longer particularly relevant to what was happening. "The freeze goes live at 9, Sutherland said. "I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do." Adrian ended the call. He stood in the middle of the hotel suite, Vanessa still asleep behind the half-closed bedroom door, the city going pale and gray outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he felt the specific, disorienting sensation of a man who has been standing on what he believed to be solid ground and is only now registering the absence of it beneath his feet. I was at his office by 7:30. 2 of his department directors were already there, which told him enough about the speed at which word was traveling. His assistant, a composed young woman named Priya, who had worked for him for 3 years and was not easily rattled, met him at the elevator with a tablet and an expression calibrated carefully between professional neutrality and genuine alarm. "Hargrove is confirmed," she said, falling into step beside him. The lender sent the formal notification at 6:52. Meridian. "The institutional pull is real. I spoke to their representative directly, and she said the withdrawal is being characterized as a portfolio realignment, which is what they say when they don't want to explain the actual reason. Coastal Premier. I know about Coastal Premier. There's more." She hesitated. 1 half-step of hesitation, which from Priya constituted visible distress. Harrison Wolfe called. Adrian stopped walking. Harrison Wolfe was not a man you talked about the way you talked about attorneys or lenders. He was the kind of connection that existed in a different register entirely, the kind you cultivated over years, carefully, through the specific social rituals of men who understood that the most important transactions happened nowhere near a boardroom. He had been, Adrian believed, one of the 3 or 4 people in the city whose goodwill constituted genuine protection against the kind of reversal that was currently unfolding. What did he say? He said, Priya glanced at the tablet, though Adrian suspected she had already memorized the message. He said he's stepping back from the waterfront consortium. He said it's nothing personal. He said you should take a few days. She lowered the tablet. He said it twice. Take a few days. Both times. Which meant, do not call me. Do not use my name. We do not know each other right now. Adrian resumed walking. By 8:15, he had made 14 calls. 6 went to voicemail, people who had his number memorized returning deliberate silence. 4 were answered by assistants who expressed polite regret and offered to relay messages that both parties understood would not be relayed. 3 were answered directly, briefly, by men who chose their words with the precision of people aware they were constructing a record. The 14th call was answered by a man named Declan Marsh, who was not important in the way that Wolf was important, but was useful in a different way, connected to older money, older networks, the kind of infrastructure that predated the current political cycle and would outlast the next one. Marsh had done Adrian favors that lived in a part of the ledger neither of them ever discussed directly. You know why I'm calling, Adrian said. I have some idea. Marsh's voice was carefully flat. I heard about yesterday. The courthouse. The helicopter. A brief pause. The man who got out of it. I need to understand what's happening, Declan. The financing. The investors. Someone is pulling every line I have simultaneously, and that doesn't happen organically. That's coordinated. Yes, Marsh said. It is. The simplicity of the confirmation hit Adrian somewhere behind his sternum. You know who? I know of him, Marsh said carefully. I've never had direct dealing. I've been strongly advised on multiple occasions by people whose judgment I trust that direct dealing is not something to pursue. It's Draven. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Adrian, what did you do to that woman? I divorced her. What did you do to her? The question had a different weight the second time. Adrian thought about the courtroom, the clearance rack dress, the way he'd spoken over his shoulder from the doorway, the particular precise sentence he'd landed on his way out, aimed with the casual cruelty of someone who doesn't expect it to matter. Nothing violent, he said. That's not the same as nothing, Marsh said. And I suspect Cassian Draven is operating with a definition of harm that covers more ground than you're accounting for. He paused. I can't help you with this. I want to be honest with you because I think you're not getting a lot of honesty right now. No one you know is going to be able to help you with this. Whatever connections you've built, whatever goodwill you've accumulated, it doesn't reach where this is coming from. There has to be someone. There isn't, Marsh said. I'm sorry, Adrian, I genuinely am. The line was quiet for a moment. If I were you, I would figure out what Draven actually wants. Because if he wanted you simply destroyed, you'd already be further along in that process than you are. The fact that it's been 12 hours and you're still making phone calls suggests there's something else at play. He stopped. Find out what it is. The call ended. Adrian set the phone face down on his desk and looked out the window at the city that had been, for 15 years, the primary geography of his ambition. And he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. The specific, humbling terror of a man who has confused a long run of success with personal invincibility and is now confronting the difference. He found her through Griffith, which took until noon. Not Celine. Finding Celine, he was rapidly discovering, meant navigating the specific problem that the woman he had been married to for 5 years had apparently been operating under an identity so thoroughly constructed that its removal left almost nothing behind. No digital trail. No social presence. The email address he had for her returned an auto-response that had clearly been set up months in advance. The phone number went to a carrier message indicating the number had been disconnected. She had been planning this exit. She had been planning it for longer than the divorce proceedings. That realization arrived like a slow, cold tide. Not a single wave, but an accumulation, the water rising around him while he'd been looking in the other direction. What he found was Vanessa. Not where he expected to find her. She hadn't returned to the suite the previous evening. He'd come back at midnight to an empty room and a text message that said only at Celia's back tomorrow, which he hadn't questioned because Celia was a friend, and tomorrow was today, and he'd had larger concerns. But at noon, Vanessa was not at Celia's. Celia herself answered the door of her downtown apartment in a bathrobe with the expression of someone who had been woken recently and did not appreciate it, and informed him that she hadn't seen Vanessa since Thursday. "She told me she'd be at yours," Celia said, with the specific weariness of someone who has spent years politely not commenting on a friend's life choices. "I assumed that meant the suite." Adrian stood in the hallway outside Celia's door and called Vanessa's number. It rang 7 times. Voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail. He texted, "Where are you?" Then, 30 seconds later, "Vanessa, call me." He stood in the hallway for a moment, phone in hand, the particular low-grade alarm of the unanswered call working at the edges of his composure. She wasn't reliable about her phone. She often left it in bags and cars, and the various domestic environments she moved through with the cheerful inattention of someone who had never experienced a consequence serious enough to require constant availability. He'd been annoyed by it before. He told himself it was that now. Inattention. She'd surface by 2, 3 at the latest, with some explanation involving a late night and a dead battery. He went back to the office. By 2 o'clock, she hadn't called. By 4, his assistant had exhausted the list of numbers Vanessa typically responded to. By 5:30, with the first of the formal bank notifications arriving in his legal team's inbox, and the Meridian withdrawal filing hitting the public record, and 3 separate journalists leaving messages that ranged from politely inquiring to nakedly predatory, Adrian Voss was sitting at his desk with the increasingly unmanageable awareness that 2 catastrophes were occurring simultaneously, and he could not determine whether they were connected. He called Griffith. "Find her," he said. "Vanessa?" "Yes." A pause. "Adrian, I'm a corporate attorney. I'm not— You know people who find things. You found things for me before. Find her." Griffith was quiet for a moment. "How long has she been unreachable?" "Since last night." "That's not— Find her." Cashin Draven's building was not listed under Cashin Draven's name. It was a converted industrial property on the south end of the waterfront district, the kind of building that had spent several decades as various things before someone with significant capital and no interest in explaining themselves had acquired it, renovated the interior to standards that would not have been obvious from the street, and established within it the particular combination of residential space, operational infrastructure, and controlled access that characterized the private holdings of men who moved through the world without announcing themselves. Celine had been in the building before, years ago, during a different life. Walking into it now felt like reading a sentence you'd memorized so long ago that the words were still in your mouth, even though the meaning had changed completely. Her brother met her in the 4th-floor common room, a space that managed to be both functional and unexpectedly calm. Long windows facing the water, furniture chosen for use rather than display. Cashin was at the table with 3 of his people when she came in, and he looked up with the specific expression he reserved for her. Not quite a smile, but something that involved the eyes differently than his other expressions did. "You slept," he said. "Barely." She pulled out a chair, didn't wait to be invited. "Tell me what you've done." He glanced at the other 3. Mara, who ran communications and had the general demeanor of someone who had heard everything twice. Stefan, who handled logistics and said approximately 14 words per day. And Lucien Moreau, who served as Cassian's consigliere and had been with the family for 11 years. A slim, silver-haired man with excellent posture and the patient, precise quality of a chess player who is already several moves ahead. "Give us a minute," Cassian said. The 3 filed out. Lucien last, pulling the door closed behind him with the quiet, particular care he brought to everything. When the door clicked shut, Celine looked at her brother across the table and said, "How much?" Cassian leaned back. "Define how much." "Don't." Her voice was even, which she knew he recognized as the more dangerous register. "The banks, the investors. Declan Marsh got a call this morning. Harrison Wolfe. You moved fast." "He spent 5 years. I know what he spent 5 years doing." She pressed her hand flat on the table. "I was there. I don't need the inventory." She watched his face, looking for the particular set of his jaw that meant he'd already committed to something she couldn't walk back. She found it. Cassian. He needs to understand what he did. He needs to understand it on his own. That's different from... She stopped, exhaled. You cannot dismantle someone's life as a lesson in my behalf. That's not... He humiliated you in front of... He divorced me, she said. People get divorced. It's not a capital offense. She looked at him steadily. I chose to be there. I knew who he was within the first year, and I stayed because I was still trying to believe I'd been wrong about him. That's on me, not on you to correct. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. He had a quality she'd observed in him since childhood, an absolute, unmoving stillness when he was deciding something, the way some animals go completely motionless before they move. The finances are already in motion, he said. I can't undo what went out last night. Can you stop what hasn't gone out yet? He was quiet. Cassian. I'll consider it, he said, which was not yes, but from him it was not nothing. She stood, moved to the window. Below, the waterfront was doing its ordinary afternoon business. Cargo movement, dock workers, the mechanical rhythm of a working port. She used to find that rhythm comforting as a child, when she'd come to buildings like this one and watch the water and pretend the family she'd been born into was simply an unusual family rather than what it actually was. He's going to come looking for answers, she said. Let him look. I'm serious. He's going to try to find me. Cassian's voice shifted slightly. Do you want him to find you? She considered the question with the honesty it deserved, stood at the window and let herself actually consider it, rather than producing the answer that was neat and self-contained and required no further examination. No, she said finally. Then he won't. She turned from the window. And Lucien? Does he know everything? Something moved across Cassian's face. Brief. The flash of something that might have been consideration or might have been something else. He knows what he needs to. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have. He stood, came around the table toward her, and when he reached her, he put one hand on her shoulder. Not an embrace, just a point of contact, the way they had always done this. The two of them, since they were children learning that the family they'd been born into required a different vocabulary of comfort than most. You came back, he said. That matters more than anything else right now. Everything else, Adrian Voss, the finances, the noise, it's secondary. It doesn't feel secondary. It will. She wanted to believe him. She had always wanted to believe him, and had always known, in the part of herself that she kept most honest, that wanting to believe someone and having evidence to believe them were not the same thing. She touched the necklace at her collarbone. I need a few days, she said. Take them. She nodded, moved toward the door, had her hand on the frame when Cassian spoke again. Celine. She stopped. He said something, in the courthouse, when he was leaving. Cassian's voice was entirely level, which meant something. My people were there. She didn't turn around. I know what he said. And? A long pause. The waterfront sounds from below. A gull, somewhere. And it was exactly what I expected, she said. That's the worst part. Not that it surprised me. She left before he could respond. The call came at 9:17 that evening. Griffith. His voice stripped of its usual professional lacquer, reduced to something raw underneath. They found her car, he said. Adrian was out of the chair before he'd registered the movement. Where? Parking structure off Renner Avenue, underground level. The car was running. A pause. Adrian? She wasn't in it. The suite was very quiet. Through the window, the city's lights reflected off a low cloud layer, the whole sky a dull amber pressing down. Her phone was on the passenger seat, Griffith continued. Her bag, her wallet, everything still there. It means someone didn't want her to have the ability to call for help or identify herself. Griffith's voice was careful in a way that sounded like effort. There was also... The responding officer described what he found on the seat beside her phone. A note. Handwritten. 3 words. Adrian heard himself breathing. What 3 words? Griffith said them. Give us access. The suite felt like it contracted, the walls moving slightly inward, the air going thin and strange. Adrian pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum and stood there in the amber-lit dark of the room. Access to what? He said, though some part of him was already assembling the answer, the pieces clicking into place with the horrible grinding precision of something inevitable. That's what we need to determine, Griffith said. But Adrian, listen to me carefully. The phrasing, the method, what they left behind, this is not random. This is someone who knows something specific about Vanessa that we don't. Something about what she has access to, or what they believe she has access to. He stopped. And given the events of the last 24 hours, I don't think it's a coincidence. Adrian moved to the window. Below, the city continued. Traffic, pedestrians, the ordinary blind motion of a million people going about the business of their lives in complete ignorance of what was compressing itself into the space of this hotel room, this phone call, these 3 words on a seat cushion. They think she knows something about Draven, Adrian said. Griffith didn't answer immediately. That's my read. Because of me. Because of who they think I am to her, and who they think she is to me, and what they believe that combination of relationships implies about what she might know or be able to access. Yes. Adrian closed his eyes. Someone had taken Vanessa because they believed she was leverage. They had taken her not for anything she had actually done, not for anything she actually knew, but because of the constellation of relationships surrounding her, including, somewhere in that constellation, the woman Adrian had spent 5 years failing to see. And whoever had taken her did not know, or did not care, that Adrian Voss had no access to Cassian Draven's anything, that he was not a player in that world, that he was, from the perspective of anyone looking for a way into the Draven organization, precisely the wrong man, a man who had just discovered 12 hours ago that the woman closest to that organization had spent 5 years beside him in quiet, deliberate anonymity, and had walked away from him yesterday with nothing but a silver necklace and no intention of looking back. He was going to have to go to her. The realization settled through him with the slow, heavy clarity of something already decided. Not a choice exactly, more like the recognition of the only remaining door in a room where every other exit had been sealed. He was going to have to find Celine and stand in front of her and explain what had happened, and he was going to have to do it as the man he actually was. The man who had dismissed her and diminished her and walked out of that courtroom without turning around, and who was now standing at the far end of his own arrogance with nothing left to bargain with except the truth. Griffith was still talking. Adrian heard the words from a slight distance, the way you hear things when your mind is already somewhere else, already working the problem, already understanding that everything that comes next will be harder than anything that came before. There's something else, Griffith said. Tell me. The federal contact I have, the one who's been tracking the Draven organization for the last 3 years, he reached out this evening. He said the note, the phrasing, the methodology. He's seen it before. Not from Draven. From someone operating adjacent to Draven. Griffith paused. Someone inside the organization who has been quietly, for a long time, working a different agenda. The Amber City pressed against the glass. He has a name, Griffith said. Tell me the name. And across the room, in the reflection of the window, Adrian watched his own face receive it. Watched something shift behind his own eyes as the name arrived. A name he had heard once, briefly, in the 4th-floor common room of a waterfront building. He had no reason to know existed, a name spoken in passing by a man with excellent posture and the patient, precise quality of a chess player who had already decided the game several moves before anyone else had sat down at the board. Lucien Moreau. The name sat in the room like something with mass. Adrian stood at the window and set it back, quietly, not as a question but as a man testing the weight of something he's just picked up and isn't sure he can carry. Lucien Moreau. That's the name my contact gave, Griffith said. He wouldn't put it in writing. He called from a personal line, not his office. He said if I repeated it in any official context, he would deny the conversation entirely. A pause. He sounded frightened, Adrian. This man has been working organized crime investigations for 11 years, and he sounded genuinely frightened. What does he know about Moreau? He said Moreau has been operating a secondary agenda inside the Draven organization for at least 3 years. Quietly. The kind of quietly that requires patience and access, and the specific ability to make things appear to originate somewhere they didn't. Griffith's breath came through the line slightly unsteady. He said the financial moves against you, the banks, the investors, Wolf. He believes those didn't come from Cassian. Adrian turned from the window. Say that again. He believes Moreau initiated them, using Cassian's resources, Cassian's network, but without Cassian's direct instruction. A pause. He said Moreau has been learning to imitate Cashin's operational signature for years, well enough that even people inside the organization can't easily distinguish the source. The room reconfigured itself around this information. Adrian stood in the middle of it and let the reconfiguration happen, let the pieces move into new arrangements, because the alternative was to resist it, and the time for resistance to uncomfortable information had passed approximately 24 hours ago. He set the whole thing in motion, Adrian said. The financial collapse. Vanessa. That's my contact's read, yes. Why? Griffith was quiet. Why would Moreau want to? That, Griffith said carefully, is a question I think you need to take to someone with more visibility into the Draven organization than either of us has. Adrian understood what he meant. He ended the call. He stood in the suite for 60 seconds, doing nothing, which was the most productive thing available to him in that moment, letting the understanding arrive fully rather than moving before it had finished arriving. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, put it on, and walked out of the hotel into the amber-lit city night. He had no idea where the building was, but he knew how to find people who did. It took him until 11:15 to get an address, and the route to that address involved 3 phone calls he would not have been willing to make 48 hours ago. A conversation with a man who operated a private car service that was not primarily a car service, and the particular humiliation of explaining to each of these people, men who knew his name, who had attended his events, who had eaten at his tables, that he needed help and had very little left to offer in return for it. Nobody refused him. That surprised him slightly. He had expected the same wall of professional distance that had met him all morning, but the night produced a different response. Quieter, more considered, as though the darkness changed the calculus of who owed whom and why. The building on the waterfront was dark from the outside, which told him nothing. He stood on the sidewalk across the street for a moment, collar up against the wind coming off the water, and thought about what he was doing. He was walking into the operational center of the most powerful criminal organization on the East Coast to tell the head of that organization that his trusted consigliere of 11 years was running a covert agenda using his resources, had kidnapped a woman in order to leverage access to the Draven financial network, and had spent months orchestrating a sequence of events, beginning with the systematic destruction of one man's financial life, and ending, for the moment, with an empty car in an underground parking structure and a handwritten note that appeared designed to fracture the organization from within. He was doing this because he had no other option, and he was doing it having spent the last 5 years being wrong about almost everything. He crossed the street. The man at the entrance looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has been told to expect many things and is evaluating which category this new arrival falls into. Adrian said his name. Said he needed to speak with Celine, said it was about Lucien Moreau. The man's stillness shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something more alert. He made a call. Adrian waited on the sidewalk for 4 minutes in the cold wind off the water. Then the door opened. She was not glad to see him. That was the first thing, the absence of gladness, which was different from anger or contempt, and in some ways harder to absorb. She stood in the room they brought him to. A spare, functional space on the second floor, 2 chairs, a table, no concession to comfort, and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has already done the work of putting something behind her and is deeply unenthusiastic about having it reappear. Adrian, his name in her mouth, flat, without inflection. Not hostile, just completed, like a sentence that has already been spoken. He looked at her. He had not seen her since the courthouse, since the gray dress and the uncapped pen and the door swinging shut. She was dressed differently now, dark, practical clothes, hair down, and without the courthouse's fluorescent flatness, the reality of her was different than his memory of her, which had always been a slightly diminished version, he understood now, because diminishment had been the perceptual habit he'd been operating from. "I know I'm not who you want to see," he said. "No," she agreed. "You're not." "Vanessa's missing." Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly. Something more like an alert, a recalibration. "Since when?" "Last night. They found her car this morning, running in a parking structure. Her bag, phone, wallet, still there." He watched her face. There was a note. 3 words. "Give us access." Celine was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, Access to what? That's what I need to understand, because whoever took her believes she can provide access to something inside your family's organization. He paused. And I have reason to believe the same person who took her is responsible for what's happened to my financing in the last 24 hours. Her eyes sharpened. Who told you that? A federal contact, someone who's been watching your organization from the outside. He chose the next words carefully. He gave me a name. She waited. Lucien Moreau. The room changed, not visibly. Celine didn't move, didn't change expression in any dramatic way. But something behind her eyes shifted with the particular quality of something that has been suspected finally being confirmed, and Adrian watched it happen and understood that this information was not, to her, entirely new. You say that again, she said, quietly. Moreau, your brother's consigliere. My contact believes he's been running a secondary operation inside your organization for at least 3 years, initiating moves that appear to come from Cassian, but don't. And now this, Vanessa, the note. Whoever took her believes she's a path to your family's financial network. He held her gaze. Celine, if Moreau has been imitating Cassian's operational signature from inside, then he knows more about that network than almost anyone. She crossed to the door, opened it, and said something brief to whoever was outside. Then she turned back to him. Sit down, she said. I'd rather sit down. He sat. She remained standing, arms crossed, and looked at him with an expression that he had never, in 5 years, seen on her face. Not because she hadn't been capable of it, he understood now, but because she had never had reason to show him this version of herself. The version that had grown up inside a world that required you to evaluate everything quickly and trust almost nothing. How long have you known this contact? She said. 3 years. He's legitimate, federal, not freelance. And he came to you directly. Through Griffith, my attorney. Why you? I think... He stopped, reorganized. I think because Moreau's opening move was against me, the financing. He needed something that would force me into contact with your family, and destroying my business created a situation where I'd have to come looking for answers. He watched her absorb this. I was a mechanism, Celine. Moreau used my divorce, my financial exposure, my connection to you as the first move in something larger. She uncrossed her arms, moved to the window, which looked out over the same waterfront he'd seen from the floor above, the same dull light on the same black water. He's been with Cassian for 11 years, she said. Not to Adrian. More to herself or to the window. He was my father's before that. He knows everything, every account, every arrangement, every... She stopped. Every contingency. If he's planning to take control, he's not planning to take control, she said, and the certainty in her voice was absolute and cold. He's been taking it, incrementally, for years. She turned from the window. I need to get to Cassian. She was already moving past him toward the door when he stood. Celine. She stopped. Didn't turn fully, just angled slightly, enough to hear him. I know this isn't the moment, he said. I know what I am to you right now, and I know I don't have standing to ask you for anything. But whoever Moreau sent for Vanessa, she's not part of any of this. She doesn't know anything. She can't give them what they want. A pause. I know that, Celine said, which means when they figure that out, I know what that means, she said, and her voice was not unkind exactly, but it was not gentle either. It was simply a voice that had already run the calculation and arrived at the answer and was not going to pretend otherwise. Come with me. Cassian was on the 4th floor. He was not alone. Mara was there, and Stefan, and 2 men Adrian didn't recognize who had the physical economy of people trained to move in tight spaces under bad conditions. What was not there, Adrian noticed immediately, was Lucien Moreau. Cassian saw Adrian's face, then Celine's. Tell me, he said. She told him. Efficiently, without theater. The federal contact, the name, the methodology, the secondary agenda, Vanessa, the note. She laid it out in the sequence it had arrived, and Cassian stood at the head of the table and listened without interrupting, and his face during this recital was something Adrian could not read. Not shock, not rage, but something deeper and more controlled than either, the expression of a man receiving information that lands in a place that had been, without his knowledge, already softened for impact. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then Cassian said, How long has your federal contact been watching? 3 years, Adrian said. Give or take. Cassian looked at him directly for the first time since Adrian had come into the building. It was not a comfortable experience. And he came to you? Yes. Why not to me? Because, Celine said quietly, going to you would have required your contact to expose himself to the organization. Going to Adrian was safer. Adrian had no standing, no connections, no leverage, nothing to do with any of this. A brief pause. He was the cleanest channel available. Cassian held Adrian's gaze for another moment. Then he turned to Mara. Lucien, he said. Mara's face was already careful. He left the building at 7 this evening. I logged it as routine. Where? He said the Harwick address, his usual Tuesday. She hesitated. I didn't verify. The temperature in the room dropped without changing. Pull everything he's touched in the last 6 months, Cassian said. Every authorization, every communication that went out under my name. I want to see the originals against what was actually sent. He looked at Stefan. Quietly. Nothing that signals outward. Stefan nodded once and left. Cassian moved to the window, stood with his back to the room for a moment, hands at his sides, and the absolute stillness that came over him was different from the stillness Adrian had observed in the plaza footage, that had been deliberate, performative in its own controlled way. This was private. This was a man processing something that had happened inside a trust he had maintained for 11 years, in a relationship that predated almost everything he had built, and the processing of it was not something he was willing to perform for an audience. Celine crossed to him, stood beside him at the window, not touching, just present. The financial network, she said, low. Moreau has access to the architecture. He helped build it, Cassian said. If he's been mapping it for 3 years, he knows where everything is, Cassian said. Every account, every arrangement, every institution we're exposed through. A pause. Which means he doesn't actually need Vanessa to provide access. He already has it. The room recalibrated around this. Adrian spoke carefully. Then why take her? Cassian turned from the window. Because she's not leverage for access, he said. She's leverage for something else. His eyes moved to Adrian, and in them was the particular quality of a man who has just understood something he didn't want to understand. She's leverage for Celine. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. He knows you came back, Cassian said to his sister. He knows you're here, and he knows that of everything I have, every resource, every arrangement, every contingency. He stopped. You are the one thing I won't trade. Celine's face had gone very still. So the woman isn't bait for the organization, Adrian said. She's bait for my sister, Cassian said. He takes someone connected to Adrian. Adrian comes here. Celine gets drawn into the open. He crossed to the table, put both hands on it and looked at the surface for a moment. He's been waiting for her to come back. Everything else, the financial moves, Voss, the note, it's staging. Celine is the target. Adrian looked at her. She was standing at the window now, where Cassian had been, looking out at the water, and her face was the face of a woman absorbing a truth she had maybe half known was coming. The face of someone who had walked away from this world precisely because she understood what it required and had discovered, years later, that what you walk away from does not always agree to stay behind you. He wants control of the organization, she said. He's been building toward it for years, Cassian said. But while you're alive and present, there are captains who won't move, old allegiances. There are people who knew our father who would not transfer their loyalty to Moreau while a Draven heir stands in opposition. He paused. You coming back changed his timeline. He had to accelerate. Where is he now? Celine said. Working on that? Mara said from across the room, her attention on a tablet, her fingers moving. Vanessa is somewhere on a clock, Adrian said. When they can't get what they want from her. I understand the timeline, Cassian said. He looked at Adrian with a measurement in his expression that had not been there before. Not warmth, not acceptance, but the specific recalibration of a man revising an assessment. You came here tonight instead of going to federal authorities. Federal authorities would have required me to explain why I had a source inside your organization, Adrian said, and Vanessa would be dead before the paperwork cleared. Cassian held the look for a moment longer. Then, almost imperceptibly, something in his jaw unclenched. Mara, he said, give him the secondary floor. It was not, Adrian understood, an invitation extended with warmth. It was a provisional arrangement made under specific circumstances by a man who trusted no one lightly and was extending the minimum necessary cooperation with the maximum necessary caution. But it was something. He took it. The secondary floor was a working space 2 levels below the main operations. Functional, spare, 3 rooms connected by a short corridor. They gave Adrian a room with a cot, a phone charger, and the specific atmosphere of a space that had housed various people in various states of crisis, none of them entirely comfortable. He didn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, Celine appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment without speaking, and in the low light she looked different from the woman in the 4th floor room. Or rather, she looked like what she was, tired. The particular bone-deep tired that isn't about the hour, but about everything that has converged into the hour. "He's been watching me for years," she said. Not an opening to a conversation, more like a sentence she needed to say out loud to determine how it felt. "Moreau. Even when I was with you, he knew who I was." She leaned against the doorframe. "Cassian says Moreau was the one who found out about Adrian Voss in the first place. 3 months after I started seeing you, he came to Cassian with information, where you lived, what you did, your financial profile." She paused. "Cassian assumed it was protective, looking out for me. But Moreau wasn't protecting me," she said. "He was monitoring a variable, making sure I was contained, in a relationship with someone who had no connection to the organization, no leverage, no way to accidentally pull me back in." She looked at the full to him, Adrian. "Our marriage was useful to him. It kept me neutralized." Adrian sat with this for a moment. "He didn't want you to come back," he said. "He spent years making sure I stayed gone," she said. "And then you—" She stopped. "I made you leave," Adrian said. "The divorce forced my hand," she said, without particular blame in it, which was somehow worse than blame would have been. "I was running out of reasons to stay anonymous. And when Cassian came to the courthouse," she shook her head slightly. "Moreau saw it happen. He watched me come back in real time on his surveillance feed, and he understood his entire arrangement had just collapsed. So he built a new one," Adrian said, "faster. He had contingencies," she said. "He always has contingencies. 11 years with Cassian. He knows how we operate. He knows how I think. He knows—" She pressed her lips together briefly. "He knows I won't let an innocent person take damage that belongs to me." Adrian looked at her. "Vanessa," he said. "He knew I'd move," she said. "He knew Cassian would have to let me, because containing me under these circumstances would cost him the captains he can't afford to lose right now." She looked at Adrian for the first time since she'd appeared in the doorway, and the look was direct and unsparing and contained, somewhere in it, something that was not forgiveness, but was perhaps the acknowledgement that forgiveness was a concept that still existed in the same universe as what they were discussing. "He built the whole sequence around my psychology, around what I would do and what I couldn't stop myself from doing. Using me as the mechanism," Adrian said. "Using everything," she said. "That's what 11 years buys you." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The captains are meeting tomorrow. Cassian is calling it for 9 in the morning." She pushed off the doorframe. "Moreau will know about it within the hour. He has people inside, so not many, but enough. When he knows the meeting is happening, he'll understand that Cassian has figured out the broad shape of what's going on. And he'll move." "He'll move," she said, "which means Vanessa has until tomorrow morning, and then the calculus changes." Adrian stood. "Where would he take her?" "The organization has properties. Cassian is working through the list." She paused. "There's one Moreau controls directly, has controlled for 6 years off the main books, in a way that I don't think even Cassian knew the full extent of until tonight." Her voice had a quality he'd not heard in it before. Not quite cold, not quite hard, but something approaching both. "An industrial site, South Cargo District. Moreau acquired it through a series of shell transfers that took Stefan 3 hours to trace." "Does Cassian know you're telling me this?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to answer the question. "Celine, he's going to move Vanessa in the morning," she said, "before the captain's meeting, before Cassian can coordinate a response. He'll move her, and he'll use her as a public point of leverage, visible enough that it becomes an organizational problem, not just a tactical one." She looked at him steadily. "I can't wait for 9 o'clock. "You're going tonight," he said. "I'm going at 4, she said. With or without you. Adrian stood in the spare, low-lit room on the secondary floor of a building he had never expected to be inside, in the company of a woman he had failed to understand for 5 years, looking at the specific, unambiguous expression of someone who has made a decision and is offering, once, the option of standing beside it. He thought about the courthouse, the pen, the door, the sentence he had thrown over his shoulder like something disposable. He thought about Vanessa in an unknown room on an unknown clock, unable to provide what was being demanded of her, because she did not have it, and had never had it. And what happened to people in that position when the people holding them arrived at that conclusion? "I'm going with you," he said. Something in Celine's face shifted, barely, just at the edges, just enough to register. Not relief, not gratitude, something quieter. The acknowledgement of a choice made without conditions. "There's a vehicle on the lower level," she said. "Be ready in 90 minutes. She turned and walked down the corridor, and Adrian watched her go and understood, with a clarity that had the specific flavor of things understood too late and then understood again in a different light, that whatever he had believed about this woman across 5 years of ordinary mornings and dismissed evenings and conversations redirected away from her, whatever diminished version he had built and maintained and lived beside, had nothing to do with who she actually was. Who she actually was had been there the entire time, waiting with the patience of someone who has learned that the truth about a person arrives on its own schedule, and that there is nothing to be done about the ones who are not ready to receive it. He sat back down on the cot. 90 minutes. Somewhere in the South Cargo District, in a building that had spent 6 years being laundered through Lucien Moreau's careful paperwork, Vanessa Hale was sitting in the dark with the growing understanding that what her captors wanted from her was something she could not give, and that the moment they fully arrived at that understanding, whatever protection her value as leverage had provided would dissolve completely. Adrian set his watch. In the corridor outside, the building held its silence, the specific operational silence of a place that has learned to be quiet. And somewhere above him, in the working rooms of the 4th floor, Cassian Draven was looking at 6 months of communications that bore his operational signature and were not his, tracing the architecture of a betrayal so careful and so complete that it had lived inside his trust for years without disturbing a single surface. And in a spare room 2 floors below, a man who had spent 15 years building something he believed was solid was sitting on a cot with his watch running, preparing to walk into a burning building that was not his fire, for a woman who owed him nothing, beside a person he had failed so thoroughly that the failure had its own separate weight. The 90 minutes were the longest of his life, and when they ended, he was already on his feet before the time arrived. Standing in the corridor, jacket on, completely unprepared for what was coming, and the only honest thing left available to him. The vehicle was a black SUV with tinted glass and plates that Celine didn't explain and Adrian didn't ask about. She drove. That was the first thing that registered. She slid into the driver's seat with the ease of someone who had been doing exactly this, in exactly these circumstances, long before she'd ever met him, and the ease of it recalibrated something in the air between them. Adrian took the passenger seat. In the back, 2 of Cassian's people, a woman named Reyes with close-cropped hair and the compact stillness of someone who has learned to conserve everything, and a man called Drift, whose actual name Adrian never learned, arranged themselves with the particular practiced economy of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. Nobody spoke for the first 6 minutes. The city at 4 in the morning had its own specific character, not empty, exactly, but reduced, stripped of its daytime performance, the streets showing their actual geometry without the traffic and noise that usually obscured it. Celine drove without consulting anything, no phone, no navigation, taking turns with the certainty of someone following an internal map. "You've been to this property before," Adrian said. "No." She checked the mirror. "But I grew up reading site maps. Old habit." A pause. "Moreau used a series of holding companies. The terminal itself is registered under a logistics firm that dissolved in 2019. The physical address still receives city maintenance schedules, which means it's active enough to need upkeep, but inactive enough to avoid inspection." She took a left onto a service road that ran parallel to the waterfront. "Moreau is thorough. He always was. It was one of the things my father valued most about him." "Your father trusted him." "My father trusted very few people," she said, Moreau was one of them, which tells you either that Moreau was an exceptional actor for a very long time or that my father made one significant error in an otherwise careful life. She paused. I think it was both. The service road narrowed. The waterfront opened up to their left. Dark water, distant lights from cargo ships at anchor, the smell of salt and diesel coming through the ventilation, even with the windows closed. Adrian watched the road and felt his pulse doing something he chose not to examine too closely. When we get inside, Celine said, you stay with me. You don't improvise. You don't make decisions independently. Whatever you see, whatever happens, you follow my lead and you do it without asking questions in the moment. She glanced at him briefly. Can you do that? Yes. I mean it, Adrian. I know you mean it, he said. Yes. She looked back at the road. From the back seat, Reyes said quietly, 60 seconds. The terminal appeared out of the dark, a low, long structure set back from the waterfront access road, surrounded by chain link that had the specific texture of infrastructure that is maintained just enough to exist and no more. No lights visible from the exterior. A vehicle gate on the south side, padlocked, and beside it, a smaller pedestrian access point with a keypad that had not been upgraded since the building's active years. Celine cut the headlights 200 meters out, coasted to a stop behind a concrete barrier that had probably once marked a parking boundary and now just existed, as these things do, without purpose. She turned off the engine. In the sudden silence, Adrian could hear his own heartbeat with unpleasant clarity. There are 3 ways in, Celine said, low. Moreau will have the main entries covered. 1 person each, maybe 2. He doesn't have an army here. He couldn't move that many people without Cassian noticing the resource drain. He has what he could pull quietly. She looked at Reyes. East loading dock. There's a secondary mechanical access point that predates the current structure. It's on the original 1987 site plans, which Moreau would have had, but it's small enough that he might not have considered it worth covering. Might not, Reyes said. That's the best I have, Celine said. Reyes, south entrance. You're creating noise. Drift, east face, parallel to the dock. I want Moreau's people looking outward when we come in through the mechanical access. She looked at Adrian. You're with me. They moved. The mechanical access was a low concrete channel on the northwest face of the building, a utility corridor that had probably serviced HVAC infrastructure in the terminal's working years. The cover was a steel panel, corroded at the hinges, that required Celine to apply her full weight before it gave with a sound that Adrian's nervous system registered as approximately equivalent to a gunshot, though in the context of the empty waterfront, it was probably inaudible beyond 20 meters. Probably. She went in first. The channel was narrow. Adrian had to angle his shoulders to follow her, moving on hands and knees across concrete that was wet with something he decided not to identify. The smell of rust and standing water and old machinery pressing in from all sides. 20 feet, 30. A turn to the right, slightly upward, and then a grate that Celine pushed out with the heel of her hand and caught before it could clatter. They came up inside the building. The terminal's interior was vast and dark. The specific darkness of a large industrial space with no active lighting, where the ambient light from the waterfront came through high windows in thin, unreliable strips. Stacked cargo containers, long disused, shelving structures, the skeletal remains of a conveyor system that ran along the north wall and disappeared into the far dark. Celine stood still for 10 seconds. Adrian stood beside her and breathed through his nose and did not move. She was listening. He understood that, not just hearing but processing, sorting, the way you sort when you have been trained to identify what is meaningful in ambient noise. He stood beside her and tried to do the same, and mostly just heard his own pulse. Then she touched his arm, 2 fingers, pointed left, toward the south side of the building. Voices. Low, male, the cadence of people conducting something rather than waiting, active, purposeful, though not urgent. 2 sources, maybe 3, in the far south corner where the ambient light was slightly better from a high window facing the access road. She moved. He followed. They crossed 40 feet of open floor in the dark, staying close to the shelving, the concrete silent under their feet, because Celine moved in a way that distributed her weight differently than people who had never been taught to. and Adrian watched her feet and copied the placement as closely as he could and managed, mostly, not to make it worse. The voices resolved. Two men visible through a gap in the shelving, near a portable work light set low to the floor, both armed, neither of them looking in the right direction because Reyes was doing something audible on the south entrance that had their attention pulled the wrong way. Good. Beyond the men, in the far corner, a door. Utility room. Light coming under it in a thin line. Celine looked at him. Her eyes in the dark were very clear. She held up two fingers, pointed at the men. Then she pointed at herself, then at the door. He understood. He also understood that he had approximately 1 second to process the gap between what she was indicating and what he had actually ever done in his life, and that the gap was substantial, and that it did not matter. He nodded. What happened next occurred in a sequence that Adrian would later be unable to fully reconstruct in the order it happened because his nervous system had been operating at a register that compressed time unevenly. What he knew was that Celine moved from his left into the gap in the shelving with a speed and economy that was startling, even knowing she was about to move. And the first man went down before the second man turned, and the second man was in the process of turning and raising something when Adrian came around the shelving from the other direction and did what he had not known he was going to do until the moment he did it, which was close the distance in 3 steps and drive his shoulder into the man's torso with everything he had, taking them both into the shelving, and the shelving lost that argument, and they went through it together, and the sound of that was considerable. The man hit concrete, and Adrian hit the man, and the thing the man had been holding went somewhere in the dark. Everything went very still. Adrian was on his hands and knees with his ears ringing and his right shoulder saying several things he would process later. The man under him was not moving. Celine was already at the door. She tried the handle. Locked. She looked at the men on the floor, moved to the nearer one with focused efficiency, and found what she was looking for in his jacket pocket in approximately 4 seconds. Keycard. She ran it across the panel beside the door, and the lock disengaged with a sound like a breath releasing. She pushed the door open. Vanessa Hale was sitting on the floor in the far corner of the utility room with her wrists zip-tied to a pipe and her hair in her face and an expression that had been moving for however long she'd been here, through several stages of fear, and had recently arrived somewhere past fear into a kind of hollow, exhausted suspension. She looked up when the door opened. Her eyes found Celine first because Celine was in front. I don't know you, Vanessa said. Her voice was rough. No, Celine said. She was already moving across the room, pulling something from her jacket. You don't. She crouched in front of Vanessa and began working at the zip ties. Are you hurt? My wrists and my... Vanessa stopped. Her eyes had found Adrian in the doorway behind Celine. Whatever was in her face then was complicated in a way that the circumstances didn't allow to fully resolve. Adrian. Hey, he said. It was completely inadequate. He knew that. Hey, Vanessa said, and her voice broke slightly on the single syllable, and she pressed her lips together hard. The zip ties came loose. Celine helped her stand, and Vanessa stood with the careful, testing quality of someone who has been in one position for a long time and isn't certain yet what works. She held on to Celine's arm for a moment, longer than strictly necessary, and Celine let her, without comment. We need to move, Celine said. Right now. They made it 40 feet back into the main floor before the lights came on. Not the work light in the south corner. Everything. The overhead industrial strips, running the full length of the terminal ceiling, flooding the space with the flat, blue-white quality of light, designed for function rather than human comfort. Every shadow disappeared at once. Every piece of cover became suddenly visible. And Lucien Moreau was standing at the north entrance. He had 6 people with him. More than Celine had estimated, which Adrian registered as information rather than panic, because there was no margin available for panic. Moreau stood at the center of the line with his hands in his coat pockets, and his excellent posture and the patient, precise quality that Adrian had observed in the 4th floor common room and had read, then, as the composure of a trusted professional. Now it read differently. He was 61 years old and looked it in the harsh light. The silver hair, the lines cut deep around his mouth, the eyes that had the specific, settled quality of someone who has made all the decisions that needed making and is now simply watching them execute. He looked at Celine with an expression that was not unkind, which was somehow the most alarming thing about him. Seraphine, he said, the name her brother used, not Celine. I wondered which access point you'd choose. I had the northwest covered, but your man was faster than I anticipated. Celine said nothing. Put her down, Moreau said, indicating Vanessa with a slight tilt of his head. She's not useful anymore. You can keep her. We're all leaving, Celine said. Not yet. Moreau withdrew his hands from his pockets. Empty. No weapon visible, which was either genuine or the most specific kind of threat. We need to talk. I've been trying to create conditions for this conversation for some time, and I apologize for the methodology. It was inelegant. He paused. It was also necessary. You kidnapped a woman. I borrowed leverage, he said, without heat. Leverage that I no longer need, as it happens, because you're here, which is what I needed. He took a step forward. His 6 people did not move. They were placed, Adrian noticed, covering the exits rather than advancing, which meant Moreau wanted a conversation before he wanted anything else. 20 years ago, your father made a decision about succession. You know this. He decided that his heir was not Cassian, not because Cassian was incapable, but because your father believed the organization needed to evolve, and he believed you were the only one who understood what that evolution required. Celine's jaw was set. He told me, Moreau said, 3 weeks before he died. He told me, and he made me promise. He stopped. I have kept that promise for 14 years. I have maintained this organization. I have guided your brother. I have held everything in trust. In trust, Seraphine, for the moment you came back. That's a lie, Celine said. Which part? The part where any of this is about my father's wishes, she said. My father wanted me to lead something legitimate, something clean. He was tired. He said that to me, not to you, the last time I saw him. He wanted the family out of the life, not deeper in it. Her voice didn't rise. It went lower, which was more effective. You took his words about succession, and you built a justification around them for what you actually want, which is control. And when I left and stayed gone, you had it, and now I'm back. Moreau looked at her for a long moment. You are your father's daughter, he said, and it didn't sound like a compliment or an insult. It sounded like an observation from a man who has been watching a situation develop for a very long time and has finally seen it reach the shape he anticipated. Yes, I want control. I've earned it. 11 years serving a man who is talented and loyal and utterly unsuited to what this organization is about to become. The legitimate transition your brother has been moving toward will fail. The infrastructure he's building is sound, but the external pressures he doesn't see will collapse it in 4 years. I've run the projections. He said it with the calm specificity of a man presenting a business case. I have a different direction, one that survives. Over my brother, Celine said. Your brother steps aside or he doesn't, Moreau said. That decision belongs to the captains. The captains won't. The captains will do what they have always done, Moreau said, which is follow the organizational logic of survival. And if you are not there to provide an alternative authority, he stopped. Let the unfinished sentence do its work. The terminal was very quiet. Adrian stood 3 feet behind and to the left of Celine, Vanessa's arm over his shoulders because she still wasn't fully steady, and he understood with a clarity that was almost physical that what was being said in this room was not conversation. It was the final position statement of a man who had been patient for 11 years and had run out of patience precisely because the variable he'd planned around had returned and changed his equation. Moreau wanted Celine to leave, to disappear again, to go back to whatever anonymous life she'd built and stay there. The alternative to leaving was visible in the positions of his 6 people. Here's what I know, Celine said. You moved on my brother's resources without his authority. You used his operational signature to dismantle a civilian's financial life. You took a woman who had nothing to do with anything and held her in a cargo terminal. She took a step forward, just one. And you did all of it under cover of his name, which means that when it comes out, and it will come out, Cassian takes the exposure for everything you've built. Moreau's expression shifted slightly. For the first time, something that wasn't composure. Cassian is meeting with the captains in... Celine checked nothing, she just knew. 4 hours and 11 minutes, and by the time that meeting starts, everything Stefan has pulled from the last 6 months will be on that table. Every authorization you generated in my brother's name. Every financial instruction. Every communication. She paused. Every captain in that room will know exactly whose signature was real and whose wasn't. The something in Moreau's expression completed itself. Adrian watched it happen, watched the patient chess player composure recalibrate in real time as it absorbed the information that the position he believed he held was not, in fact, the position he held. "You've already sent it," Moreau said. 40 minutes ago, Celine said. "Mara distributed everything. It's already in their hands." For 3 seconds, Lucien Moreau stood in the middle of his own terminal in the flat industrial light with his 6 people at the exits and the leverage he'd taken and arranged and maintained for months dissolving in real time. And his face during those 3 seconds was the face of a man revising his entire forward plan while standing still, which Adrian recognized because he had been doing a version of that for 2 days. Then Moreau's right hand moved toward his jacket, and the east loading dock blew inward. The detonation was not large, controlled, shaped, the kind of explosive application that takes out a specific structural point rather than a building. But in the enclosed space of the terminal, it hit like a physical force, a compression wave that knocked Adrian sideways and sent Vanessa into him, and sent him into the shelving, and sent the shelving into the floor in a cascade that was happening while the sound of it was still arriving. Dust. Darkness at the edges, too. 2 of the overhead strips blown out by the concussion, the remaining light strobing for 3 full seconds before stabilizing. The smell of burning metal and something chemical underneath it. Adrian was on one knee with Vanessa half under him and his ears doing something painful and his vision doing something similar, and the specific, urgent inventory of his body reporting in from various locations with varying degrees of alarm. He got upright. Reyes was coming through the blown dock entrance with Drift behind her, and 2 more of Cassian's people behind Drift, moving through the debris with the specific, low-efficient movement of people who have trained for entry under chaotic conditions. And the clarity of their training against the chaos of the room was something Adrian would remember afterward as almost beautiful in its contrast. Moreau's 6 people were not where they'd been. The detonation had scattered the formation. 3 of them had gone down in the initial compression, not injured badly but disoriented, and the other 3 had their attention divided in the worst possible way between the entry team coming through the dock and Celine, who was no longer 3 feet in front of Adrian. He looked for her. She was at Moreau, not at his people, at him directly, closing the distance between them while his attention was still processing the dock breach. And she moved the same way she'd moved in the dark of the main floor, with the specific economy of someone who doesn't spend motion on anything unnecessary. Moreau was fast, faster than his age and his composure suggested, the reflexes of someone who had once, many years ago, been the kind of person who did this kind of thing before he became the kind of person who had other people do it. He had the weapon out of his jacket before she reached him, and he had it raised, and for 1 second Adrian's heart stopped entirely. Celine didn't stop moving. She changed angles, dropped her shoulder, came in from the left instead of the front, and the shot Moreau fired went somewhere into the ceiling, and she had his wrist with both hands, and they went into the nearest cargo container together with a sound like a car accident. Adrian moved. He didn't think about it. He was moving before the decision formed, across the floor between them, vaulting something he didn't see clearly, arriving at the container where Celine and Moreau had gone down in a tangle of coats and struggling limbs, and the specific brutality of 2 people who are both very clear about what is at stake. Moreau had the size advantage. He recovered it, got an arm free, used the weight, and Celine took a blow across the shoulder that put her down on one knee, and he was getting up, getting the weapon back from wherever it had landed, his hand closing on it. Adrian took 3 running steps and hit him from behind, not skilled, not trained, just mass and momentum and the particular desperate physics of a man who has no other option and has stopped performing the internal calculation of what he's capable of. He hit Lucien Moreau at full speed, and they went into the side of the container, and the weapon hit the floor, and Moreau hit Adrian with an elbow that rearranged something in his face, and Adrian held on anyway, because holding on was the only available verb. Celine was up. Moreau drove an elbow back a second time, and Adrian's grip broke and he went sideways and caught the floor with his hands and knees, and his vision went briefly white, and in the white he heard something. A sharp, decisive impact. The specific sound of a physical confrontation ending rather than continuing. The white cleared. Moreau was on the floor. Celine was standing over him, breathing hard, her hair half down from whatever had held it, a cut on her cheekbone that was doing what cuts do. Her hands were at her sides and her chest was moving, and she was looking down at the man she had known since childhood. The man who had attended her father's table, who had helped plan her father's funeral, who had spent 11 years inside the trust of her family like something that belongs there, with an expression that was not triumph and was not satisfaction and was not any of the things that the end of a physical confrontation is supposed to produce. It was something older and more tired than any of that. Reyes had the 3 standing members of Moreau's team contained in the time it had taken all of this to happen. Drift had the others. The terminal was full of movement and low voices, and the settling sounds of disturbed metal and the chemical smell of the blown dock. And through the hole where the dock door had been, the sky outside was beginning to go from black to the specific dark gray that precedes dawn. Vanessa was sitting against a shelving unit with her knees up and her arms wrapped around them, watching everything with the expression of someone who has been through something they will spend a long time processing and have not yet begun to do so. Adrian got to his feet. Did it in stages. Hands to knees, knees to upright, upright to stable, which took longer than it should have. His face was reporting in loudly from the location where Moreau's elbow had landed. I was going to have opinions about that later. Not now. He crossed to Celine. She didn't look at him immediately. She was still looking at Moreau on the floor, and Moreau was looking up at her with the specific expression of a man who has arrived at the final position of a plan that did not execute as intended and is doing what such men do. Not collapsing, not pleading, but recalibrating. Still recalibrating, even now, the chess player finding the next move on a board that has just been overturned. "It's not over," Moreau said. His voice was steady, which was either admirable or chilling, depending on your perspective. "The captains are reading everything right now," Celine said. 11 years of everything, your everything." She paused. "It's over, Lucian." He looked at her for a long moment. "Your father would have—" "Don't," she said. Just the one word. Quiet, final, the sound of a door closing. Moreau closed his mouth. Celine turned from him and looked at Adrian, and the look she gave him was the first fully unguarded look she had directed at him in the 48 hours since any of this had begun. Not the courthouse look, not the hotel floor look, not the look of a woman managing a situation. Just a person looking at another person in the aftermath of something, in the gray pre-dawn light coming through a blown-out dock door, with the particular stripped-down quality of 2 people who have just been through something together and are still here. His face hurt. He was fairly certain something in his shoulder was not where it had been that morning. He was also, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate and didn't try to, more present in his own life than he had been in years. "Are you hurt?" she said. "I'm fine," he said. She looked at his face. "You're not fine." "I'm functional," he said. "That's close enough." Something moved in her expression that was not a smile but was adjacent to the conditions that produce one. She looked at him for another second, then looked at Reyes. "Secure him. We need to be clear of this location before federal response to the detonation." She looked at the terminal around them, the blown door, the overturned shelving, the evidence of what had happened here, and then at the gray sky showing through the gap. "Cassian needs to know we have Moreau." "Already sent," Reyes said, phone in hand. Celine nodded. She moved toward Vanessa and Adrian moved with her, and when they reached her, Celine crouched down to eye level with the woman who had been, in a different life, the reason she'd signed the papers. "Can you walk?" Celine said. Vanessa looked at her with eyes that had too much in them to make sense of quickly. "Yes." A pause. "Who are you?" "Someone who was in the right place," Celine said. She stood, extended her hand. Vanessa took it. They were moving through the terminal, toward the blown dock, toward the gray dawn and the cold waterfront air, and whatever came next, and Adrian was 2 steps behind Celine, watching her move and carrying in his chest the weight of everything he had not seen and everything he now could not unsee. And somewhere above the terminal, the sky was turning from gray to the first thin edge of something that was not yet light, but was the direction. Behind him, zip-tied and on the floor, Lucien Moreau was already working on his next position, because men like that never stopped, and Adrian heard him say one more thing as they walked away. Not to anyone in particular, maybe to the terminal, maybe to the evidence of 11 years of careful, patient architecture that had arrived at this specific unintended conclusion. You won't be able to hold it, Moreau said. What you're building, what Cassian thinks he's building, the external pressures. Lucien, Adrian said, without turning around. Moreau stopped. Nobody's listening, Adrian said. He walked out through the blown door into the gray dawn behind Celine Draven, and the cold waterfront air hit him across the face where it was swelling, and it was not pleasant, and it was completely real, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately account for, the reality of a moment was not something he was trying to manage or redirect or position himself advantageously within. He was just in it. Celine was 3 steps ahead of him, already on her phone to Cassian, her voice low and efficient, and carrying the specific authority of someone who has stopped pretending to be smaller than she is. And the first real light of morning was beginning to find the water to their left, and the day was coming whether anyone was ready for it. The captain's meeting lasted 4 hours and 19 minutes. Adrian knew this because he sat in a room on the 3rd floor of the waterfront building with an ice pack held against his face and a cup of coffee that went cold in his hands. And he counted the time, the way you count things when you have nothing useful to do and too much to think about, and the discipline required to not think about it is the only productive expenditure of energy available to you. Vanessa was in the room across the corridor. A doctor, not a hospital doctor, a private one, the kind of arrangement that families like this one maintain for circumstances exactly like this, had examined her within 40 minutes of their return. 2 fingers on her right hand, fractured from how she'd braced against the pipe. Bruised ribs. Dehydration. Nothing that wouldn't heal, which was the sentence the doctor delivered and which Adrian heard through the wall and felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight since the parking structure on Renner Avenue. He had looked in on her once. She was sitting on the bed with her hands wrapped and her eyes on the window. And when she heard him in the doorway, she turned, and the expression on her face was one he didn't have a ready category for. Not anger, not relief, not the particular emotional accounting he'd half expected. Just a person looking at another person across a distance that had been measured and found to be larger than either of them had fully registered before. "You brought her," Vanessa said. Not an accusation, an observation. "She brought herself," Adrian said. Vanessa looked at him for a moment. "Who is she?" "Someone I should have known better," he said. It was the most accurate thing he'd said in recent memory, and it wasn't enough, and he didn't try to make it more. Vanessa looked back at the window. He left her to it. The meeting broke at 9:47 in the morning. He knew it had broken because the building changed. The specific, almost atmospheric shift that occurs in a structure when a collective decision has been made and the people who made it begin to disperse. A change in the pressure of movement and voice that Adrian registered from the 3rd floor before he heard anything specific. Then Mara came through the door. She looked at him with the professional neutrality she brought to everything, which he was beginning to understand was not coldness, but economy. A woman who conserved expression because she had learned that expression cost something in the environment she moved through. "The captain's reached a decision," she said, "and Moreau is being turned over to federal authorities." She paused in a way that indicated this was not the uncomplicated outcome it might appear. "With full documentation, 11 years of it, the financial irregularities, the unauthorized operations, the communications generated under Cassian's signature." She folded her hands. "Cassian's attorneys have been working through the night on the framing. The exposure is real, but contained. Most of what Moreau built was specifically designed to be attributable to him rather than the family, which was presumably useful to him as leverage and is now useful to us as insulation. And Cassian is legitimate enough on paper that the federal review will be uncomfortable but survivable." She said it the way you say a thing that is both true and an understatement, and she said it with the particular awareness of someone who has done the work to make it true. "The transition the organization has been making toward legitimate operations accelerates now." The captains voted unanimously. A slight pause. "That's not typical." "What changed their vote?" Mara looked at him steadily. Seraphine addressed the meeting. Adrian absorbed this. "She spoke for 40 minutes, Mara said. "I've been in this organization for 8 years. I've seen Cassian move rooms. I've seen the kind of authority that this family carries when it walks into a space." She paused once more, and this pause was different from the others. It had something in it that was not quite sentiment, but was in the neighborhood of it. She moved them differently, not through power, through clarity. She looked at the ice pack in his hand, the swelling on his face, the general condition of a man who has been through something. She also told them what happened at the terminal. What you did. Adrian said nothing. Cassian wants to see you, Mara said. When you're ready. Cassian was in the fourth-floor room. Alone, which was itself a statement. Adrian had not seen him alone in any room since arriving in the building. There had always been people in the peripheral spaces, the operational furniture of a man whose solitude is a managed resource. I was at the window when Adrian came in, turned when he heard the door. He looked at Adrian's face for a moment, the swelling, the cut where Moreau's elbow had done its work, with an expression that contained several layers, not all of them immediately readable. Sit down, Cassian said. I'm fine standing. I know you are, Cassian said. Sit down anyway. Adrian sat. Cassian remained at the window for a moment, then moved to the chair across the table. He sat with the deliberate quality he brought to everything, not slowly, but with intention, each movement chosen. He put his hands on the table and looked at them briefly, then at Adrian. I want to tell you something, Cassian said. And I want to do it once, clearly, so there's no ambiguity about where I stand. He paused. I was wrong about you. Adrian waited. Not about what you did, Cassian said. You spent 5 years beside my sister, and you didn't see her. That's not a small thing, and I'm not going to minimize it. What I'm saying is I was wrong about what you are, which I assessed too quickly based on what you did. He looked at Adrian directly. The terminal. You went in without training, without standing, without any obligation that anyone could have enforced. You covered her. He paused. That matters to me. She didn't need covering, Adrian said. No, Cassian said. She didn't. But you didn't know that when you moved. He held the look for another moment. So, I wanted to say it. Adrian nodded. The ice pack in his hand had stopped being cold. He set it on the table. The Federal Review, he said. My financing. Moreau's documentation will clarify the origin of the moves against your accounts, Cassian said. The paper trail leads to him, not to any legitimate instruction. Your attorneys will have what they need by tomorrow morning. He paused. Some of what was moved cannot be returned quickly. The institutional relationships, Wolf, the others. Those will require time. Trust, once it's been interfered with, doesn't restore by paperwork alone. I know that, Adrian said. You're looking at 18 months, maybe 2 years, before your financial position is what it was. Cassian said it without softening it. Possibly longer, depending on how the Federal Review characterizes the peripheral associations. Peripheral associations meaning me. Meaning anyone whose name appeared adjacent to Moreau's operations, Cassian said. You're not a target, but you're in the blast radius, and blast radius takes time to clear. Adrian sat with this. The window behind Cassian showed the same waterfront it always showed. The water, the cargo movement, the ordinary machinery of commerce. And the morning light on it was the specific clean light of a day that had decided to be clear after a long sequence of overcast. Where is she? Adrian said. Cassian's expression shifted slightly. Not suspicion, more like consideration. The look of a man who is deciding something. She's on the roof, he said. She goes there when she needs to think. She's been up there since the meeting ended. Adrian stood. Adrian, Cassian said. He stopped. She walked away from everything once, Cassian said. From this family, from the life, from everything that came with the name. She did it because she needed to find out who she was when she wasn't anyone's daughter, or anyone's sister, or anyone's heir. He paused. She found something in those years, something quiet, something that was hers. He looked at Adrian with the specific, unblinking quality that made rooms go still. She lost something too. I'm aware of what it was, and I'm aware of who was holding it when it was lost. Another pause. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you that what she's built, who she is now, that doesn't need anything added to it. If you go up there, you go without an agenda. I don't have an agenda, Adrian said. Cassian looked at him. Adrian stopped, found the honest version. I need to say something to her that I should have said a long time ago, not because it changes anything, because it's true and she deserves to hear it said plainly. He paused. That's all I have. Cassian held the look for 3 full seconds. Then he said, Roof access is through the stairwell at the end of the corridor. The roof was flat and wide, bordered by a low parapet, with a view of the full waterfront, and beyond it, the city rising in layers against the morning sky. The air up here was different from the air below. Cleaner, moving, carrying the salt off the water, and the cold of October that the building had been insulating against. Celine was standing at the east parapet with her forearms on the edge and her eyes on the middle distance, the water and the ships and the cranes of the working port. She had changed, different jacket, hair pulled back, and the cut on her cheekbone had been cleaned and closed, a thin line of tape across it that she was either not bothered by or had stopped noticing. She heard him come through the rooftop door, didn't turn. He crossed to the parapet and stood beside her, not close, leaving space, and put his own hands on the edge and looked out at what she was looking at. For a moment neither of them said anything, and the wind off the water moved between them, and the city made its ordinary distant sounds. "How's your face?" she said. "It's had better days." "Your shoulder?" "Same answer." He paused. "How's your cheek?" "It's fine." A brief pause. "It'll scar." "I'm sorry." "It's not your fault." "Not the cheek," he said. "Everything else." She was quiet for a moment. Her hands on the parapet were still. She had that quality, the ability to be completely physically still while things moved in her, and he had misread it for years as absence and understood now that it was the opposite. "I know," she said. "I need to say it anyway," he said. "Not for you to respond to, not to open anything, just—" He stopped, found the sentence that was true, and said it the way true things should be said, which is without ornamentation. "I had someone extraordinary standing next to me for 5 years, and I looked past her every single day because I had decided very early on and without adequate evidence that she wasn't worth the quality of attention I gave to things I considered important." He stopped again. Felt the sentence land on him the same way it landed in the air. "That was the worst mistake of my life. Not a strategic mistake, a human one. And I'm sorry." The wind moved. Celine looked at the water for a long moment. "I knew you'd never see me," she said finally. Her voice was even, not wounded, the voice of someone who has processed something past the sharp edges into something more settled. "I thought I knew within the first year. And I stayed anyway, which is its own accounting, and I've done that accounting, and I'm not going to put the bill on you." She turned her head slightly toward him, not a full turn. "But I want you to understand something. I didn't stay because I was weak or because I didn't know my own worth. I stayed because I had spent so many years being Seraphine Draven that I wanted, badly, to be someone who could be loved in the ordinary way. By an ordinary person. Without the name and the weight of the name and everything that comes with it." She paused. "You were supposed to be that. That was what I was hoping for." "I know," he said. "You weren't," she said. "And I couldn't make you be, and eventually I stopped trying." She looked back at the water. "The divorce wasn't just you ending the marriage. It was me finally giving up on a version of myself that was never going to work." The city was very present in the silence after she said this. Adrian stood with it and let it be what it was, which was both the saddest and the most honest thing anyone had said to him in recent memory. "What happens now?" he said. "For you." She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, looking out over the water while the morning light moved on its surface. "The organization transitions," she said, "formally and completely. Cassian has been building toward it for 2 years. Legitimate security and logistics, international contracts, the infrastructure is already there. It needs leadership that can operate in both worlds during the transition period. Someone who understands what the family was and can credibly represent what it's becoming." She paused. "That's me, apparently. Do you want it to be?" A brief, surprised pause, as if the question was one she hadn't been asked, which Adrian suspected it hadn't been. "I want—" She stopped, tried again. "I want what I built during those 5 years to not be entirely erased. I want the quiet mornings, the clearance rack clothes. I want the version of myself that could sit in a coffee shop for 2 hours with a book and not be anyone that anyone needed anything from." She paused. "I also understand that what I want and what I'm needed for are not currently the same thing, and that there's a period coming where I don't get to choose between them." She looked at him. "But I'm going in with my eyes open. That's different from before." "That's very different from before," he said. She turned back to the water. He stayed where he was for another moment, long enough to take one clear look at the woman standing at the parapet in the morning light, her forearms on the concrete, her eyes on the middle distance, the scar tape on her cheek, and the old silver necklace just visible at her collar, all of it together making the specific, irreplaceable reality of a person who had stood beside him for 5 years while he looked somewhere else. He looked now. He took his hands off the parapet. "I'm going to go," he said. She nodded without turning. "Celine." He waited until she turned slightly. "I hope the quiet mornings come back. I genuinely do." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved her hair slightly. "Take care of your face," she said. It wasn't cold, wasn't dismissive. It was something much smaller and much realer. The ordinary human concern that lives below the level of the large things, that persists even when the large things are settled. He nodded, turned, walked back toward the rooftop door. He did not look back because some exits should be clean, and he had spent enough of his life making the wrong version of every departure. The federal investigation into Lucien Moreau's operations was opened within 72 hours. The documentation was comprehensive. 11 years of parallel communications, financial instructions, operational orders, all bearing the surface markings of Cassian Draven's authorization, and none of the actual chain of command that should have accompanied them. Moreau's attorneys were excellent. They made arguments that were structurally sound and temporally insufficient because the documentation had been prepared by people who had known it would need to withstand exactly this scrutiny and had prepared accordingly. Moreau accepted a negotiated resolution 8 months later. He did not cooperate with the federal investigation's broader scope. He did not name names that weren't already on the table. He went away with the specific, particular dignity of a man who has lost his position and intends to maintain everything else. And whatever he was going to do next, he was going to do it from a room that was not his choosing for the foreseeable future. The captains held. This surprised people who wrote about such things from the outside. The conventional analysis suggested the Moreau exposure would fracture the organizational loyalty that Cassian had built, that the revelation of a successful long-running deception within the family's most trusted circle would create a crisis of confidence that the transition to legitimate operations couldn't survive. The conventional analysis was wrong, partly because it underestimated Cassian, and partly because it didn't account for the 40 minutes his sister had spent in a room with 11 men who had known the Draven name since before she was born, speaking plainly about what the family had been and what it was going to become, and what she personally was willing to stake on the distance between those two things. The Draven Security and Logistics Group filed its formal incorporation documents in the spring. Adrian spent the 18 months doing what Cassian had told him it would take. He lost the Hargrove development, lost Meridian, lost 3 other projects that had been downstream of the financial freeze and couldn't be resuscitated once the institutional confidence had been withdrawn, regardless of the paper trail that exonerated the circumstances. He lost his office on the 43rd floor of a building he'd chosen specifically for the view it gave him of the city he was convinced he was conquering, and he moved into a smaller space in a less prominent building and found, to his genuine surprise, that the work he did there was better. He spent 6 months as a construction volunteer for a nonprofit rebuilding in the Eastbrook district, neighborhoods that had been systematically neglected and then systematically exploited by exactly the kind of development interests he had spent 15 years representing. He didn't announce it. He didn't hire a publicist to shape the narrative around it. He showed up on Saturdays in work clothes and did what needed doing and went home. He wasn't trying to become a different person. He was trying to find out what kind of person was left when you removed the scaffolding of success and status and the performance of importance. The answer was not heroic. It was ordinary and imperfect and more real than anything he'd inhabited in years. Vanessa was not in his life. That had ended with the quiet, mutual, unannounced understanding of 2 people who had served as useful mirrors for each other's ambitions and discovered, in the aftermath of something real, that mirrors were not the same as company. She moved to the West Coast. He heard she was doing well, and he was glad, and that was the whole of it. Griffith remained his attorney. Sutherland eventually took his calls again. Harrison Wolfe did not. The first time he saw Celine again was 14 months after the roof. He was crossing the lobby of a building in the financial district, a meeting with a banking contact who was tentatively discussing the possibility of rehabilitation. and she was coming out of the elevator with two people he didn't recognize, mid-conversation, in a dark suit that was nothing like the clearance rack gray of the courthouse, and everything like the authority she'd stopped pretending not to have. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. The two people she was with continued talking for 2 steps before they noticed she had stopped. Adrian stopped. They looked at each other across 40 feet of lobby with the particular quality of two people who have a complicated history and are encountering each other without preparation in a public space. And the first thing he noticed was the scar on her cheekbone, thin, barely visible, the kind of mark that in a certain light could be missed entirely, and in another light was just there, part of the face, the way earned things are just part of a face. She said something to the two people with her. They nodded and moved toward the door. She crossed the lobby. He met her in the middle. "Adrian," she said. "Celine." He paused. "Seraphine." Something in her expression shifted. Not correction, not preference, just the acknowledgement of the name as a name, the whole name, all of it. "Either works," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The lobby moved around them in its indifferent way. "You look well," he said. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to actual questions, as opposed to rhetorical ones. "Less performed," she said finally. "I'll take it," he said. She almost smiled. The almost smile was the same as he remembered it, the expression that arrived at the edge of a smile and stopped just before, and he had misread it for years as reserve and understood now that it was something more careful than reserve, the expression of a person who had learned to check what they were about to give before they gave it. "The organization," he said. "I've read about the transition." "What did you read?" "That it's working," he said, "that the Draven name is being rebuilt on different foundations, that the woman running it is—" He stopped. "The articles are not adequate," he said, "but they're trying." "They always are," she said. "Are you getting the quiet mornings?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Some of them," she said. "Not all, but some." "That's more than before." "Yes," she said. "It is." The lobby continued around them. Someone moved past with a rolling case, and a phone rang somewhere, and the light through the front glass was the flat, clean light of a Tuesday in December, and none of it was remarkable, and all of it was present in the specific way that ordinary things are present when you have stopped filtering them through the lens of what they're supposed to be producing for you. "I have somewhere I need to be," she said. "I know," he said. "Me too." She nodded. Pulled her coat slightly against herself. A small, ordinary gesture. A person doing a small thing against the cold draft from the lobby door. "Take care of yourself, Adrian." "You too," he said. She moved past him toward the exit. He stood where he was. At the door, she paused. Not a long pause. Not a cinematic pause. Just the natural hesitation of a person stepping from one temperature into another, and then she pushed through into the December street and was gone. He stood in the lobby for a moment longer. Outside the glass front, he could see her moving along the sidewalk, the dark coat, the particular way she carried herself now that was different from the woman who had signed the papers in the gray dress, not larger exactly but more complete, more fully occupying the space she moved through. She walked without looking back, and the December crowd absorbed her, and then she was simply a woman on a street in winter, indistinguishable from anyone. He thought about 5 years. He thought about the specific sentence he'd thrown over his shoulder in a courthouse doorway, and about the ice-cold clarity with which she had received it without flinching, and about the silver necklace at her collarbone that had been there the entire time he'd been looking past her, and about everything he had cost both of them with the quality of attention he'd been willing to bring. He didn't try to make a lesson out of it. Lessons implied you could apply them, and you couldn't apply this one retroactively, and the forward application was just called living differently, and he was doing that as well as he knew how. He pushed through the lobby door. The cold hit him clean across the face. He turned in the direction of his meeting, which was 3 blocks north, and he walked. And the city did what cities do, continued, indifferently, enormously, full of a million separate accountings happening simultaneously, none of them complete, all of them in motion. Somewhere ahead of him, the street went on. He followed it. The silver necklace was in a drawer in Celine Draven's office on the 8th floor of the building that bore her family's name. Not worn, not displayed, just kept, in a small drawer in the left side of the desk, beside a folded piece of paper that she had written on and never sent and never intended to send, which was the document of everything she had understood about herself in the 5 years she had spent trying to be ordinary, which was not nothing, which was in fact the most important thing she owned. She wore the necklace on some days. Not all of them, some. On the days she wore it, the people in the building noticed that she moved through the halls with a particular quality, not harder, not softer, but more settled, the way things are settled when they know what they are and have stopped debating it. Her assistant noticed. Mara noticed. Cassian noticed, though he said nothing, which was the most eloquent thing he could have done. On the days she didn't wear it, she was still herself. She had learned to be herself on purpose. It had taken everything she had and cost her more than she'd budgeted for, and she was not finished with the learning, and the not finishedness of it was something she had decided to stop treating as a problem. In the morning, sometimes, she sat at the window with coffee and looked at whatever the morning was doing outside it. Sometimes the mornings were clear, and sometimes they weren't, and she had stopped deciding in advance which kind she preferred, because she had found that the ones you don't prefer have a habit of being the ones that give you something useful, and the habit of preferring comfort over usefulness was one she was actively, specifically, daily trying to break. She was better at it than she had been. She wasn't as good at it as she intended to be. Both of those things were true, and between them was the space where she lived, and the space was enough. And on most days, not all but most, it was more than enough. The city below kept its ordinary motions. She watched it for a while, the way you watch things when you have finally given yourself permission to watch them without calculating what they're supposed to mean. And then she set down the coffee and picked up what was waiting for her on the desk, and got back to the work of building something that would outlast the person who was building it. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.